Thank you, co-chairs, for giving me the opportunity to present the Arctic Declaration on the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, known as the Nuuk Arctic Declaration. I was appointed to do the presentation by the Arctic Caucus session held yesterday here in Alta. In the Arctic region, 2 Indigenous Preparatory Conferences have been held, with the objective to preparing the Arctic region's Indigenous Peoples' contribution to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014. A Pan-Sami Preparatory Conference was held in Inari, Finland, from 27th to the 28th of June 2012, where Sami representatives from Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Russia adopted a comprehensive set of recommendations as contained in an outcome document called the Inari Declaration. Moreover, an Arctic Indigenous Peoples Regional Preparatory Conference for the United Nations World Conference on Indigenous Peoples was held in Nuuk, Greenland, 23rd to 24th of October 2012, attended by Sami and Inuit representatives. This conference, which I, along with James Stott, Alaska President of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, co-chaired, adopted an Arctic Declaration on the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, known as the Nuuk Arctic Declaration. The Nuuk Arctic Declaration contains specific and concrete recommendations for the inclusion in the final outcome document of the World Conference, structured under following 8 overarching themes, which represent the most pressing and urgent matters for the Arctic Indigenous Peoples. Theme 1, Indigenous Peoples' Right to Self-Determination. First of all, this theme recognizes the urgent need to take decisive and concrete measures to ensure full and effective implementation of Indigenous peoples' rights, including the rights recognized in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with a particular focus on lands and resource rights and their right to self-determination. It underscores also that respect for their right to self-determination constitutes a prerequisite for the realization of all other human rights and fundamental freedoms, and that the Indigenous people's right to self-determination encompasses the right to identify who belongs to the people in accordance with the traditions and customs of the peoples concerned, compatible with international human rights standards. The second theme, Indigenous peoples' right to territories, lands, waters, resources, and traditional livelihoods. Indigenous peoples' rights to territories, lands, waters, resources, and traditional livelihoods are of fundamental importance for the survival of Indigenous peoples around the world. This headline recognizes, among others, the control by Indigenous peoples over developments affecting their territories, lands, waters, coastal waters, and other resources, enables them to freely pursue their traditional livelihoods and economic, social, and cultural development, including to maintain and strengthen their food security in accordance with their own aspirations and needs. It also highlights that states have an obligation to ensure the full and effective implementation of Indigenous peoples' rights, to continuously pursue their traditional livelihoods, including hunting, fishing, and herding, in accordance with their own traditions and customs, and calls on states not to develop or implement environmental protection regimes harmful to indigenous peoples' traditional livelihoods or in violation of their human rights, including rights to practice their traditional livelihoods. In order to achieve the ends of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it is recommended that an appropriate voluntary international mechanism be established to receive and to consider communications from indigenous peoples claiming that their rights to territories, lands, and resources, and or their right to self-determination has been violated. The third theme, extractive industries. Regarding the extractive industries, the new Arctic Declaration reaffirms that indigenous peoples' rights to land and natural resources require third parties to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent before entering their territories, and recognizing that the Arctic is subject to a constantly accelerating amount of industrial activities, and that Arctic indigenous communities and traditional livelihoods are under rapid and increasing pressure from, among others, oil and gas, mining, forestry, and windmill industries, and associated infrastructure developments. It also underscores that existing corporate social responsibility regimes such as the OECD guidelines and the Global Impact fail to ensure that private entities operating in the Arctic conduct themselves in a manner respectful for the rights of indigenous peoples of the Arctic. In relation to the extractive industries, the new Arctic Declaration further recommends, among others, that the Arctic Council adopts at its ministerial meeting in 2015, in close collaboration with the permanent participants of the Arctic Council, Sami parliaments, and competent Arctic self-governments, a comprehensive long-term strategy for sustainable and equitable resource extraction in the Arctic region, to end and prevent uncontrolled, unmanaged, and unsustainable industrial practices, and that the Arctic Council adopts at its ministerial meeting in 2015 an ethical code of conduct committing private entities operating in the Arctic region not to engage in practices harmful to the environment and to respect human rights, particularly those of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. Theme 4, optional protocol to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The new declaration considers that the denial of indigenous peoples' right to self-determination and their rights to territories, lands, and resources is the most fundamental violation of indigenous peoples' collective human rights. Furthermore, it recognizes the urgent need for the establishment of effective international measures to guarantee and monitor the implementation of indigenous peoples' right to self-determination and their rights to territories, lands, and resources without prejudice to the rights which peoples under colonial or other forms of alien domination or a foreign occupation have under existing international procedures. Theme 5, further measures for the implementation of rights of indigenous peoples. Since the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the process of the implementation of the Declaration has been questioned due to the process. This theme recognizes that states are obliged to take concrete and action-oriented measures to recognize, realize, concretize, and substantively implement the rights of indigenous peoples. It also recommends that states present annual reports on what measures they have taken to effectively implement the rights enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to be presented to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other relevant United Nations institutions and processes. It further recommends that states, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, as a matter of urgency, initiate a comprehensive review of existing national legislation, including constitutional provisions, with the aim of ensuring that national legislation is fully consistent with or exceeding existing international standards concerning the rights of indigenous peoples. Theme 6, Culture, Language, Education and Health. The section on culture, language, education and health recognizes the need to adopt effective measures to guarantee indigenous peoples and individuals the right to the full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, as recognized in international human rights law, including the right to culture, language, and education. The section also calls on states to cater for an environment that allows indigenous children and youth with a background in indigenous peoples in traditional livelihoods to participate actively in such livelihoods, to ensure the transfer of customs, belief systems, values, and traditional knowledge from generation to generation as a prerequisite for maintenance of and involvement of indigenous cultures, identities, and languages, and to ensure that indigenous youth can participate in decision-making processes specifically affecting them, including through providing sufficient resources for such participation. I am reminded that my time is running out. We have theme 7, which deals about indigenous peoples' cross-border rights. That is of special interest for the Sami, and I know that it also is of interest for a lot of other indigenous peoples. But let me then finalize my presentation by mentioning theme 8. Regarding the UN system and international cooperation, the Nuuk Arctic Declaration recommends that the United Nations General Assembly organizes a comprehensive high-level review of the progress achieved in the implementation of the recommendations adopted at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, with the aim to further strengthen the realization of the rights of indigenous peoples, to be held during the 74th session, that means September 2019, September 2020. It also requests the United Nations to establish as a matter of priority an appropriate mechanism to consider the ways and means of promoting participation at the United Nations of Indigenous Peoples representatives on issues affecting them. The Nuuk Declaration also recommends that the United Nations General Assembly appoint an Under-Secretary General for Indigenous Peoples with the aim to strengthen United Nations capacity and efforts towards ensuring the full realization of the rights of indigenous peoples, and in order to ensure that these rights are taken into account in all activities of the United Nations. In conclusion, co-chairs, I want to use this opportunity to inform the Alta participants that during the session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues recently, the Arctic region urged the members of the Permanent Forum, when developing possible recommendations to the Economic and Social Council on the World Conference, to take into account that the global indigenous consultations on the substantives and the thematic aspects of the World Conference are yet to be completed. We hope this reminder was duly noted by the members of the Permanent Forum. For further details on the Nuuk Declaration, please consult the GCG's website, where it is posted in the various working languages. Thank you, co-chairs.
Thank you.